Today for Devotions with Daniela, we are reading White Women Get Ready, How Healing Post-Traumatic Mistress Syndrome Leads to Anti-Racist Change. Y'all, I'm working on this book for my own practice, and if you want to follow along with me, you can get copies here. While 18th century scientists developed theories of race to justify historic and ongoing European racism, the emergence of whiteness a century before had granted the poorest of European women a track toward good wife status. Notably, good, white, wife status existed in codependency with its contrast. The pedestal carved uniquely for white women upheld an idealized standard of beauty while disembodying them from schmexuality. Like the Madonna, white women gained status from the contradictory requirements of chaste, virgin, attractive ideal, fertile bearer of white progeny. The closer black womanhood became associated with wickedness, lasciviousness, and immorality. The closer white womanhood came to holiness, chastity, and purity. And this is the skinny white woman trope in cults. These fundamental ideals became culturally embedded in American aesthetics and in its institutional foundation. At the end of the day, these cultural beauty standards were about control. They still are. Almost 2 centuries before Blumenbach theorized race in Germany, the British founded the colony of Virginia during a time of intense allegiance to patriarchy, and, as Brown observes, anxious ones at that. Possibly the need to reinforce this narrative of British male superiority was heightened by the reality. Finding a European woman to subordinate in early 17th century Virginia proved difficult. While large numbers of European men had been brought as laborers to the early British colonies, markedly fewer European servant women had made the trek. In the book Birth of a White Nation, scholar Jacqueline Battalora notes that for every 7 adult men, there was only 1 woman in the Virginian colony. Due to this dynamic, a woman could likely have her pick. And many did. Frequently, European servant women chose African men. In 1660, one county reported that 1/4 of all children born to English servant women had joint African and European ancestry. Unlike the anti-miscegenation sentiments later imposed by the British elite, these marriages between similarly classed people were widely accepted and commonplace. But this was not to last. After all, women having their pick flies in the face of whiteness and the European patriarchy that preceded it. Beginning in 1640, a series of laws were constructed to differentiate Europeans from their African and indigenous counterparts. Many of these laws specifically targeted reproductive labor and other forms of labor in gendered ways, ultimately carving out separate legal, economic, political, and social spheres for women based on their race. The way that race and racism became institutionalized in what would become the United States of America was not a gender-neutral endeavor. Instead, similar to European colonization in West Africa, U.S. concepts of race and racism also carried a gendered dynamic. If we are seeking to end oppression as white women, then it's important that we interconnectedly seek this. As we work our way through history toward legal whiteness, we can see how the colonial government began to codify race on gendered terms. The colony of Virginia created a separate, gendered tax category reserved exclusively for women who would soon become white. In 1643, and further legislated in the decades that followed, the Virginia Assembly required a tax on African women that was consistent with the tax on English men ages 16 to 60 and on all African men. With this new law, English women became the only category of women who were tax exempt. And rather than being taxed for their labor, they were instead classified as dependents, both servants and free, along with English children and old men. As Brown puts it, the distinction between English and African women created a legal fiction about their different capacities for performing agricultural labor. The consequences were immediate. Rather than advantage individual English women with economic independence, the tax exemption privileged English women above their non-English counterparts in exchange for their dependence on racist patriarchy. In the eyes of the law, English women, soon to be labeled white, became considered physically weak and economically dependent. Like in earlier efforts to devalue and invisibilize women's reproductive labor, the new good wife status came with conditions. As Brown describes, few English women actually benefited from their own tax exemptions. Even when single, they often lived in households of masters and fathers who owned their labor and paid their taxes. English women's privileges usually translated into gains for mostly white men who benefited from female labor. This economic bias for English women had other consequences too. It incentivized free African men to marry tax-exempt English women rather than African women, creating a major obstacle for African women to achieve good wife status, since, according to Brown, the tax on the labor of African and Afro-Virginian women was one of the first obstacles Black people faced if they wished to achieve the patriarchal family forms that conferred social standing upon white people. These taxes similarly made the large family lineages of West Africa more costly and difficult to attain. Then, in 1662, turning back centuries of British common law in the service of racism, Virginia made the status of a child, whether enslaved or free, inheritable based on that of their mother. Under British common law, land, child custody, and inheritance had all flowed through lines of paternity. Now, horridly, slaveholders became financially incentivized to systematically rape enslaved African women. The children begot through such violence would no longer follow their British paternal line as a responsibility of an inheritor to their father's name, property, and status as free. Instead, these children would become his property. In addition to the traumatic legacy of institutionalizing the rape of Black women, this law delegitimized Black parenthood by simultaneously relocating parental authority of Black children to enslavers while erasing evidence of their white paternity. Enslaved women found their children, along with their productive and reproductive labor, legally entitled to their slaveholder in perpetuity. It was on Black women's bodies that racism was thoroughly codified. Clearly, I am not the first to name this. Black women and femmes have been pointing this out since racism's inception and have been resisting every step of the way. Created by Black women and femmes, the reproductive justice movement is one of the recent manifestations of centuries of organizing by those who know the embodied horror of racism most intimately. This gruesome history has something to teach us about the sexualized violence and gendered violence of racism and our positioning within it. What did incentivizing and legitimizing the systemic violence of African women mean for European women and their reproductive labor? How did it carve out a pedestal for white womanhood built from the dehumanization of Black womanhood? As with all things racialized, there is a flip side to the coin. Battalora describes how these laws desexualized British, soon-to-be white, women, making them the only possible production site of pure British, eventually white, children, while at the same time repositioning African women as both hypersexualized and masculinized laborers. And this is what's important to remember right now, y'all. They hate white women too. They only value white women because only white women can make white men. And at some point, methinks we're going to have to stop making white men. Perhaps it is helpful for us to reconceptualize Federici's devaluation and feminization of reproductive labor at this point in history as the devaluation and racialization of reproductive labor. This devaluation of motherhood in Black women glorified an idealized virgin motherhood in white women, ultimately creating very specific, very different, and yet entirely interdependent functions for the wombs of Black and white people based on race.